They called her the She-Wolf of France, a name that echoed through centuries, dripping with betrayal, lust, and blood. But who was Isabella of France really? A ruthless queen who destroyed her husband and seized a kingdom? Or a woman forced to outwit a world built to silence her? History has often painted her in extremes, either as a cold seductress or a tragic queen. Yet between those myths lies a story far more fascinating, one of intelligence, courage, and political genius. The real Isabella was neither monster nor martyr. She was a strategist. Born in 1295, Isabella of France entered the world as a daughter of kings. Her father was Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, one of the most powerful rulers of medieval Europe. Her mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, was a noblewoman of sharp intellect and fierce independence. From an early age, Isabella learned that in royal courts, knowledge and patience could be deadlier than any sword. She grew up surrounded by luxury and politics. The French court was filled with scholars, diplomats, and whispering factions. Isabella was educated in Latin, philosophy, and statecraft, an unusual privilege for a woman of her time. Chroniclers later remarked that she had the grace of a queen, the courage of a knight, and the wit of a diplomat. By the age of 12, her fate had already been sealed. In 1308, she was married to King Edward II of England, a political alliance meant to end tensions between France and England after years of war. The marriage was celebrated with splendor. England's streets were lined with flowers and tapestries, and the people hailed her beauty. She was described as the fairest woman in all the realm, with golden hair and piercing blue eyes, a symbol of peace between nations. But beneath the glittering ceremony, trouble was already brewing. Edward II was unlike any king England had ever known. He was gentle, artistic, and affectionate, but he was also naive and easily manipulated. Most damning of all, he had already given his heart to another, a man named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, Edward's favorite, was charismatic and daring, but also arrogant. He flaunted his influence openly, mocking nobles and ignoring Isabella. At the coronation banquet, he even wore the royal jewels meant for the queen herself, a public humiliation that set tongues wagging across Europe. The marriage began in frost. Isabella was young, isolated, and surrounded by English lords who resented her French entourage. Her father's emissaries wrote home, alarmed that the new queen was being neglected and dishonored. Edward spent lavishly on Gaveston, showering him with titles and wealth, while Isabella's household went unpaid. But Isabella was her father's daughter, and she watched, learned, and waited. When the English barons finally rose in rebellion against Gaveston's arrogance, Isabella saw her chance. She played the loyal queen, standing quietly by her husband's side while secretly aligning herself with his enemies. She presented herself as the voice of reason, the dutiful wife betrayed alongside her king. It worked. In 1312, the barons captured Gaveston and executed him. Edward was devastated, but Isabella's calm loyalty through the scandal earned her sympathy and influence. She gave birth to a son, the future Edward III, securing her place as mother to the next king. For a brief time, it seemed she had tamed the storm. But peace in Edward's court never lasted long. By 1314, her father's death brought new unrest in France, and in England, the barons again turned restless. Then came a humiliation that would define Edward's reign, the Battle of Bannockburn, where the Scots crushed the English army. Edward's credibility collapsed, and with it, the stability of the crown. Into this chaos stepped a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser was everything Gaveston had been, ambitious, ruthless, and unashamedly manipulative, but he was far more dangerous. He controlled the king's council, confiscated land from nobles, and punished anyone who opposed him. The kingdom's wealth flowed into his hands, and once again, Isabella watched as another man replaced her, not only in Edward's heart, but in his politics. This time, she would not stay silent. She had learned how England worked, how its nobles schemed, and how its people whispered. She had seen that power in this world belong to those bold enough to take it, and Isabella of France was done being powerless. By the late 1320s, England was no longer the land Isabella had entered as a young bride. It was divided, paranoid, and suffocating under the rule of King Edward II and his ruthless favorite, Hugh Despenser. The Despensers, both father and son, had become the real power behind the throne. They seized vast estates, imprisoned nobles, and even ordered executions without trial. Every rebellion that arose against them was crushed with calculated brutality. Lands were confiscated, families destroyed, and the king, blindly devoted to his favorite, sanctioned it all. And Isabella, once the adored young queen, found herself surrounded by enemies and spies. Her household was dismantled, her French servants dismissed. Even her children were taken from her for their safety. Chroniclers write that the Despensers watched her every move, intercepting her letters and dictating who she could speak to. She was a queen in name, but a prisoner in truth. But the woman history called the she-wolf did not break. She studied her captors, memorized their weaknesses, and quietly bided her time. The final break came in 1325. France and England were once again on the brink of war. Edward II refused to travel to France to pay homage for his lands in Aquitaine, fearing rebellion in his absence. So he sent Isabella instead, his queen, his emissary, and, as he believed, his pawn. But it was a fatal mistake. The moment Isabella set foot in France, she was free of the Despensers' reach, and she would never return the same. At first, she played her role perfectly. She negotiated peace between the two kingdoms with grace and diplomacy. Her brother, King Charles IV of France, welcomed her warmly, offering her safety and support. But as months passed, Isabella began to transform from queen to strategist. She refused Edward's demands to return to England. "I will not come back," she declared, "until the Despensers are gone." The English court branded her a traitor. Yet in France, Isabella began to gather allies, nobles exiled by Edward's tyranny, mercenaries eager for gold, and clerics disillusioned with the king's cruelty. And then came the alliance that would change everything. In the French court, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English lord who had rebelled against Edward and escaped prison to flee to France. Mortimer was intelligent, courageous, and charming, with a reputation for boldness that matched her own. The two quickly became inseparable. Chroniclers, mostly male and hostile, would later describe their relationship as one of lust and corruption. But beneath the scandal lay a deeper truth. Isabella and Mortimer were equals in ambition. She offered legitimacy and royal influence. He offered military experience and daring. Together, they formed what was perhaps the most formidable partnership in English medieval history. By 1326, their plan was in motion. With funding from sympathetic nobles and the blessing of France, Isabella and Mortimer gathered a small invasion force, no more than 1,500 men. It seemed laughably small compared to the might of the English crown. Yet their advantage lay in something Edward had long since lost: support. When Isabella landed in England, the people rose for her. Nobles defected from Edward's side one by one. Entire towns opened their gates to her army. Her message was clear and powerful. She came not as a conqueror, but as a mother, to free England from tyranny and restore peace. The king and Despenser fled, hunted across their own kingdom. Within weeks, their power collapsed. Hugh Despenser the elder was captured and executed. The younger Despenser's fate was even worse. He was dragged before a jeering crowd, accused of corruption, theft, and treason, and condemned to death. Chroniclers describe Isabella's presence at his execution, not gloating, but calm and composed, the embodiment of justice long denied. And when Edward II himself was captured soon after, the coup was complete. Isabella entered London triumphantly, her banners flying high. The streets thundered with cheers for their liberating queen. For the first time in years, England had hope, and Isabella of France stood at its center. But even victory in medieval politics came at a cost. The deposition of a king was no simple act. England had never before witnessed a queen remove her husband from the throne. Many saw it as divine rebellion, others as an act of destiny. In early 1327, Parliament gathered to decide Edward's fate. Witnesses came forward, accusing him of misrule, favoritism, and neglect of his people. His enemies claimed he had abandoned the dignity of the crown. His own son, Prince Edward, was present, just 14 years old. When Edward II was forced to abdicate, it was his son who would replace him as King Edward III. The boy wept as he accepted the crown, while Isabella stood behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. To the watching lords, it was an image of unity, a mother guiding her son, ushering in a new era. In truth, it was an image of power. Behind the young king, Isabella and Roger Mortimer ruled England as regents. They controlled the treasury, the court, and the army. To their allies, they were saviors. To their enemies, usurpers cloaked in silk. Isabella, once a humiliated queen, now sat atop the kingdom she had conquered. But history rarely lets power rest easily in a woman's hands. Whispers began to spread, of greed, of corruption, of the queen's growing arrogance. She and Mortimer lived lavishly, hosting feasts while the treasury dwindled. Edward III, now nearly 16, began to see the truth. He was king in name only, his mother and her lover, ruling in his stead. And in the darkness of the tower, the man she had dethroned, her husband, King Edward II, still lived. The people began to murmur, "As long as he lives, no rule is safe." And soon, the she-wolf would make the most haunting decision of her life. The autumn of 1327 brought with it one of the darkest chapters in English history, and the act that would forever brand Isabella of France as the she-wolf. Edward II, the dethroned king, had been imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire under heavy guard. Though he was stripped of crown and freedom, Isabella insisted that he be treated honorably, with enough comfort befitting a man who had once been king. But mercy and politics rarely coexist. To many, Edward's very existence was a threat. England had seen rebellions rise around pretenders before. If he were ever freed or found sympathetic allies, everything Isabella and Mortimer had built could collapse overnight. Even those loyal to the new regime whispered that as long as Edward lived, England's peace would be fragile. And so, sometime that September, word spread across England. King Edward II was dead. The official story was simple. He had died of illness, quietly and without violence. But few believed it. Rumors erupted like wildfire, whispering of something far more gruesome, that he had been murdered by order of Isabella and Mortimer, silenced in the shadows of his prison. Chroniclers would later tell a chilling tale, that Edward was held down and executed with a red-hot poker to leave no visible wounds. Whether true or not, it was a story too horrific to forget, ensuring that Isabella's name would forever be linked with cruelty and blood. But behind the horror lay deeper ambiguity. No proof ever surfaced. Some even claimed Edward escaped his captors and lived in secret exile for years afterward. The truth remains uncertain, trapped between myth and political necessity. What is clear is that after his death, Isabella's power reached its peak and began its slow, inevitable decay. With her husband gone, the regency she shared with Roger Mortimer became absolute. They ruled England with a blend of intelligence, charm, and intimidation. Isabella took on the regality of a queen once more, holding audiences, issuing decrees, and overseeing the affairs of state. She ordered lavish artworks celebrating her reign and even minted coins bearing both her and her son's names. For a time, England appeared stable, but beneath the surface, resentment grew. Mortimer, intoxicated by power, began to act as though he were king himself. He seized estates, rewarded his followers, and publicly humiliated nobles who questioned his authority. He even dared to call himself Earl of March, a title reserved for only the highest peers of England. The people saw through it. To them, Mortimer was no different from the Despensers, another greedy favorite manipulating a weak monarch. And Isabella, once the nation's liberator, now seemed complicit in his arrogance. The English court turned tense, filled with fear and whispered conspiracies. Isabella had become what she once despised, the center of a court ruled by corruption and favoritism. Her son, King Edward III, watched in silence. At first, Isabella had kept him close, advising him, appearing at his side during ceremonies, guiding his education. But as he grew older, her control over him began to slip. Edward was no longer a boy. He was a king nearing manhood, surrounded by knights and advisors who resented Mortimer's dominance. The seeds of rebellion were already being sown. The turning point came in 1330. Edward III, now 17, was married and ready to rule. Yet Mortimer still commanded his armies, his treasury, and his council. The young king's patience had worn thin. He wanted to be more than a figurehead. He wanted to reclaim his crown from the mother and lover who held it hostage. At Nottingham Castle during a council meeting that autumn, Edward made his move. In the dead of night, a small group of loyal knights infiltrated the fortress through a hidden passageway beneath its walls. The Mortimer's Hole, as it would later be known. They burst into Isabella's chambers, swords drawn. She cried out for mercy as Mortimer, caught completely off guard, was dragged from her. "Fair son," Isabella pleaded, "have pity on gentle Mortimer." But Edward, no longer a boy, answered coldly, "You shall have no more pity for him than he had for my father." It was over. Mortimer was imprisoned, charged with treason, and executed without trial. His body was left hanging as a warning to all who might defy the young king. Isabella, stripped of her power, was spared execution, not out of mercy, but perhaps out of lingering filial love. Edward placed her under comfortable house arrest, granting her estates and income, but forbidding her from politics. The queen, who had deposed one king and ruled another now, lived in quiet exile, surrounded by servants and memories of the power she once held. Yet even in her confinement, Isabella remained dignified. She retired to Castle Rising in Norfolk, spending her days in prayer, correspondence, and collecting books. She maintained an affection for art, music, and the fine silks of her youth, relics of the court she once commanded. Though her influence was gone, she was never forgotten. Ambassadors still referred to her as the Queen Mother, and foreign rulers wrote to her with deference. Her son, despite everything, continued to provide for her, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps out of recognition of what she had endured. In her later years, Isabella became almost spectral, a silent figure haunted by her own legend. The chroniclers who once feared her now pitied her. They described her as a woman both blessed and cursed by power, brilliant, ambitious, but unable to escape the very system she had mastered. She died in 1358 at the age of 62, after 3 decades of seclusion. At her request, she was buried in London's Greyfriars Church, dressed in the habit of a Franciscan nun, and laid to rest with the heart of her late husband, Edward II, placed upon her chest. It was a final gesture of contradiction. Love and guilt, loyalty and rebellion, all intertwined. Even in death, Isabella refused to be simple. History has not been kind to her. Chroniclers under her son's rule portrayed her as a monster, the she-wolf who devoured her husband and poisoned the crown. But modern historians see something more complex, a woman who wielded power in a world that despised powerful women, who navigated betrayal, captivity, and war with the only weapons she had: her mind, her courage, and her will to survive. She was not the she-wolf of France. She was the strategist who dared to play the game better than anyone, and who paid the ultimate price for winning.